This video isn't as depressing as I thought it would be. Most of the time when you're playing a game that you didn't enjoy, there's an overriding feeling of regret, usually at the purchase. Regret is here, but not where you might think.
A great man once said that above all else, video games should be fun for everyone. Now, this is an interesting quote for two reasons. Firstly, it came from the mind of the late great Satoru Iwata, and he knew a thing or two about the industry he helped to create. Secondly, it's wrong. Well, by the general idea of what a video game should be, especially considering Nintendo's business model, it's an accurate assessment. But gaming is just another medium of entertainment, like a book or a movie. Those don't have to be fun. But deliberately so. I'd rather talk about video games that go out of their way to make you feel uncomfortable and drain any satisfaction out of the experience than classic video games that I just can't get on board with. I think there's plenty of mileage in creating a video game that subverts what you might expect out of it, where the takeaway is more something compelling than basic enjoyment. It's more fun to look at games this way, and that's just wrong. Making an RPG is not that hard. Okay, so making a great RPG that people will talk about for years after doesn't come naturally, but I'd argue that of all of the genres out there, it's the easiest to learn the mechanics of. There's a reason why something like RPG Maker exists. You can dissolve the basic features of an RPG into a program that helps you make them. At that point, you can wrap the game you make in whatever craziness you want, hence why a game like Yume Nikki exists. I barely know what this game is about. I think understanding this is dependent on having insomnia or abusing substances or something. I'd much rather play Lisa. That game's pretty real. A little too real.
Games like Fallout paint a post-apocalyptic world as a quirky place to be, where society is a little bit broken, but it's doing what it can with what it's got. There are plenty of characters in those games. Lisa decides to do something a little similar, but decides to do away with all the women. Basically, they're all dead as a result of this post-apocalyptic setting. It's probably not worth it.
Ah, but this game isn't called Lisa. That might be what it's called in the Steam store, but its full title is Lisa the Painful RPG, and holy fuck, there haven't been many games that have lived up to its title so aptly. Well, it comes and goes. It takes clear inspiration from the Earthbound games despite having a different camera angle, which means that it interlaces depressing content with random bits of dark humor. The difference here is that Lisa isn't set in some version of suburbia. You can barely take 2 steps without running into some horrific bit of imagery. It's a gritty, unforgiving game, sometimes a little too far. Something that even works its way into the comedy.
This is not good. Don't do it.
But you never feel it more than in the choices you have to make. None of them affect the story. You'll still travel this world as a character addicted to a drug that suppresses traumatic flashbacks of his abusive father. But every time you make one of these choices, you feel it immediately when you get back to the gameplay. Harm yourself, which then results in losing abilities for the rest of the game, or have your entire party killed. Which poison sounds tastier? These days, a lot is made of games with a morality system. It's likely that if you've played a big budget game from the last couple of years, you have experience of the game reminding you that your actions have consequences that end up affecting what kind of path you take to the end. Unfortunately, they've become a little blunt lately. Morality systems work when the line between the right and the wrong thing to do is blurred beyond recognition. Anytime you find yourself having 2 buttons to press that'll either give you a clear good or bad ending, that's pretty shit. You want to see how a morality system should be handled? Papers, please. Please. Before YouTube, I spent 14 months of my time working the phones of a company that dealt with tracking people's funds and other financial crap. Which I only mention now because the bulk of Papers, Please, where you're cross-referencing the information given to you with what you've got on file while watching out for forgeries or suspicious behavior, is a little too close to home for me. You man the border to some impoverished communist country where you make barely enough to feed your starving family, and with the amount of documentation you have to check through with the knowledge that time is of the essence, since you get paid based on how many immigrants are processed, I haven't played many more stressful games than Papers, Please. My aversion, I guess, to the gameplay comes with a huge amount of respect for everything else. The game is like this because of the scathing satire surrounding a job like this during a time like that. Of course it's stressful. What, did you think you'd be able to keep all your family alive? Glory to Art Stotska.
There's a lot of job simulator style games out there specifically designed to poke fun at the mundane nature of these tasks, which usually is played for laughs and ironic comedy. But Papers, Please, while still doing this, is far more grounded in reality. When you're knee-deep in paperwork, knowing that you have to work fast and accurately in order to feed your starving family, it does get to you. I'm glad I have YouTube these days.
You know, I didn't even plan on talking about Spec Ops The Line. I was going to talk about something like The Beginner's Guide instead. Never talked about it before, now would have been a great time, but everyone wants me to talk about Spec Ops instead. You insatiable bastards. I'd put the chance at 50-50 that if you've watched any one video of mine, you might know what makes Spec Ops The Line such an interesting game to talk about. Key part of that sentence is talk about, because at the time, while you're wading your way through a game that savagely, relentlessly assaults you for your actions, I wouldn't describe it as a particularly enjoyable experience. Hey, you know all these people you're shooting in the head? Yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. You're gonna keep doing it anyway? Okay, fine. That'll end well for you. So Spec Ops The Line is a game that deconstructs themes of bravery and bravado as a cookie-cutter protagonist shooting his way through hordes of not-so-bad guys, which is all lovely and wonderful and stuff, but even away from that, this is not a fun game to play. It's got this nifty mechanic where you can command members of your squad to go kill people or save people or whatever, but other than that, it's one of the most generic shooter games you could ever play. Until you play on the hardest difficulty, at which point it becomes cheap as all hell. The point is that regular gameplay is amazingly tedious or unfair, which saps a lot of the fun out of it, but it's thematically appropriate. Spec Ops makes murdering hundreds of relatively innocent soldiers boring. It lays it on a bit thick at points, but sometimes you need a game like this to put everything else into perspective. Not one for replay value.
Typically, any game that has a greater focus on story than gameplay can fall into the category of being a pretty good game, while not necessarily involving you enough to be considered fun. But you can still enjoy being along for the ride, right up until people start dying.
I have this theory that if you know what you have to do in a game like Telltale's The Walking Dead, you'd never play it. At least in something like The Last of Us, which takes a similarly personal look at the stories and characters behind a zombie apocalypse, you don't get a say in how things pan out. So you let it wash over you and accept that you're just a bystander. The Walking Dead, more so than a lot of Telltale's other franchises, is one punch to the gut after another. And the reality of these games is that reaching the end of an episode or a whole season, you only feel relief. How about all this gameplay though? Playing more zombie survival games than Telltale games, I kind of expected to be controlling someone behind a gun aimed for headshots. But your only contribution is choosing what to say and the occasional QuickTime event. But that's the interesting thing, despite not being hugely involved in the action, you still feel a connection with everything that happens. You still feel responsible. What sets The Walking Dead apart from, say, Game of Thrones or Batman is the subject matter. Stakes are high and the wrong decision usually ends in someone dying or irreparable damage to relationships. They make for endlessly engaging episodic adventures, but I think there's too much pressure on your choices for it to be traditionally fun. Kind of interesting going back through them intentionally making the wrong decisions though. Just how bad can it get? Oh. Let's face it, when you're looking around for video games that make you feel uncomfortable, you can't just ignore horror games. It's something every vaguely successful horror game has as a common thread. They're all part of a genre that is specifically designed to make the player feel as anxious as possible. Even lackluster horror games full of jump scares aren't characterized by players concluding at the end that, "Hey, that was really awesome, I can't wait to hop back in and experience this madness all over again." Not to say that you can't enjoy horror games, it's like the gaming equivalent of base jumping. There's nothing stopping you from chasing these thrills. However, I'd say that a truly great horror game makes you uneasy in ways that you don't even realize at the time. Perfect horror is a full-time job. Silent Hill 2 is an old game at this stage, and to its credit, it feels like it. Then again, back in 2001, it had the same air of awkwardness about it that seems to deliberately fight against the player's wishes. The controls and camera are designed to make combat something you seek only as a last resort, and at no point do you feel like protagonist James Sunderland is appropriately equipped to deal with this dirty town full of monsters with pyramids for faces. You should feel out of your depth in a horror game, and few have pitted you up against such daunting odds as Silent Hill 2. It's not really a game that you beat into the ground over the course of a playthrough. Perhaps more so than any other horror game out there, Silent Hill 2 mastered the creepy atmosphere that this genre needs to thrive. Such incredible attention to detail went into making the player feel isolated and claustrophobic within this gritty environment. My favourite being that the game's composer, Akira Yamaoka, recorded 100 different footstep sounds so that you'd never notice a comforting pattern when you're all alone with the only sounds being made coming from your feet. You might think that pushing through and overcoming this would give you some kind of gratification, but as you journey deeper down the rabbit hole, you start piecing together why James Sunderland is here and learn more about these deeply flawed characters. It's hard to empathise too much with what happens in this game, but it's all in pursuit of making the player feel even more uncomfortable. The whole game is like that, off-kilter, manipulative, which has sadly been forgotten in subsequent games. Horror games should be three-dimensional. You shouldn't enjoy them.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and despite being a punishing game with horrifying imagery, I do still play Silent Hill 2 now and again. I think because you can use it as a marker by which other horror games can be measured by. That doesn't mean that every single horror game has to be judged by the same set of rules, but I think if you want to make a really good horror game, the player shouldn't be allowed to relax at any point. Make them work for it.
Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.